Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to come face to face with raw, untamed nature in the most unexpected way possible? Picture this. You're driving down one of America's most iconic roads, right through the heart of Yellowstone National Park. The air is crisp, the towering pine trees stretch endlessly toward the sky, and the snow-capped mountains create a postcard-perfect backdrop. Everything seems peaceful, until suddenly, it's not. Without warning, the road ahead turns into something no one could have imagined. Dozens of bears, yes, real, massive, wild grizzly bears, begin to appear one after another. Some are full-grown adults, their powerful frames moving with both grace and warning. Others, tiny cubs, wobbling along behind their mothers, their little paws leaving prints in the fresh layer of snow still melting on the asphalt. Cars screech to a halt. Drivers step out with their phones, eager to capture the moment. At first it feels like a once-in-a-lifetime wildlife encounter, the kind you'd only expect to see in viral animal rescue videos or dramatic nature documentaries. But this wasn't a scene from a movie. This was real life. And what no one knew was, this was just the beginning of something far more dangerous, raw, and far more emotional. For the people stuck on that stretch of highway, it was as if time froze. Every second that passed built more tension. Some tourists laughed nervously, others whispered in fear. Parents pulled their children back inside their vehicles. The bears kept coming. Some growled, others sniffed around parked cars searching for food. Their behavior wasn't just unusual. It was a silent cry for help that no one yet understood. What was happening that day on Yellowstone's Grand Loop Road wasn't just a wildlife traffic jam. It was a survival crisis. A deadly storm was building on the horizon, sweeping down from the mountains with bone-chilling winds and whiteout snow. And these bears, with their survival instincts in overdrive, were fleeing towards the only place they knew where there might be safety: the road. This wasn't just a story of humans encountering wildlife. It was about survival. It was about fear, confusion, and one man's decision that would change everything. Among the growing crowd was Mike Johnson, a seasoned wildlife photographer who had spent years capturing images of bears in their natural habitat. But no camera lens could prepare him for what he was witnessing. Something deep inside Mike told him this wasn't just a random bear crossing. Something was very, very wrong. With each minute that passed, the situation grew more intense. The storm clouds darkened. The temperature dropped rapidly. The bears, disoriented and visibly stressed, began moving erratically between the vehicles, their growls echoing through the freezing air. Some of the cubs started crying out, high-pitched sounds that cut straight through the noise of engines and human voices. Panic was in the air. Drivers argued whether to stay put or try to drive through. Others sat frozen, afraid to move. The park rangers, nowhere in sight. And Mike? He stood there, heart racing, caught between the instinct to survive and the undeniable pull of compassion. Because what no one realized yet was that the real danger wasn't just the storm. The real danger was about to unfold right there on that icy stretch of highway. What Mike would choose to do next would not only defy all wildlife safety guidelines, but would also become one of the most talked about, heart-pounding animal rescue stories Yellowstone had ever seen. And it all started with a highway taken over by bears. Spring in Yellowstone National Park is unlike anywhere else on Earth. As the snow from a long, harsh winter begins to melt, the rivers swell with icy water, wildflowers start pushing their way through the cold soil, and the entire park slowly awakens from months of frozen silence. But along with the bloom of new life comes another predictable, yet always unpredictable event: the awakening of Yellowstone's bears. For months, these magnificent creatures, grizzly bears, black bears, and their vulnerable cubs, have remained hidden, hibernating in dens deep within the forests and mountains, their bodies surviving off stored fat, their instincts finely tuned to the first signs that it's time to emerge. And when they do, they're hungry, disoriented, and desperately searching for food and safety. The Grand Loop Road is one of the most traveled routes in the entire park. It snakes through breathtaking landscapes, open meadows, dense pine forests, and towering rocky cliffs. It's the artery that connects visitors to some of Yellowstone's most famous sites: Old Faithful, Mammoth Hot Springs, and the stunning Hayden Valley. During peak tourist season, the road is alive with traffic. Families in RVs, photographers with long camera lenses, wildlife enthusiasts hoping to catch a glimpse of a bison herd or maybe, if they're lucky, a bear. But that day was different. That day, the Grand Loop Road became something no one had ever seen before. Mike Johnson, with more than a decade of wildlife photography experience, was already parked on a pullout, reviewing photos from the morning when he noticed the first bear emerge from the tree line. His heart skipped a beat. Not because it was rare to see a bear here, but because of how the bear was behaving. Its head was low, movement slow and hesitant. Moments later, another bear appeared. Then another. Within minutes, there were over a dozen bears moving toward the road. Mike instinctively grabbed his camera and started filming, his hands trembling, not from the cold, but from something he couldn't yet explain. A deep feeling that something extraordinary and possibly dangerous was unfolding. The tourists on the road reacted just as you might expect. Car doors slammed, voices rose in a mix of fear and excitement, and smartphones began recording every second. People pointed, laughed nervously, and whispered to one another, "Is this normal? Should we be worried? What are they doing here?" But for Mike, years spent in the field had taught him to read animal behavior like few others could. And everything about this scene screamed that these bears weren't just casually crossing the highway. There was a desperation in their eyes, a restless energy in their movements. Springtime in Yellowstone was always unpredictable. But this was something else. Weather alerts had mentioned snow at higher elevations, but few believed it would reach the lower valleys this late in the season. Mike glanced toward the distant mountains and saw it. Thick, dark clouds, moving fast, swallowing the peaks in a curtain of white. As the first snowflakes began to fall, Mike's chest tightened. This wasn't just a spring storm. It was turning into a fast-moving blizzard. A sudden whiteout event in Yellowstone was dangerous for humans. But for these bears who had just emerged from months of starvation and exhaustion, it could be catastrophic. More bears arrived. A mother with 2 small cubs, their tiny bodies barely strong enough to keep pace. An older male, limping visibly. Some sniffed around the tires of parked vehicles. Others sat down right in the middle of the road, confused, disoriented. Every instinct in Mike's body screamed that this was no coincidence. The temperature dropped rapidly. The wind picked up, howling between the trees like a warning siren from nature itself. Tourists huddled inside their vehicles. Some still recorded, but now, the smiles were gone. Concern filled every face. And amid the growing fear and confusion, Mike knew. This was the moment where his knowledge, his years of photographing and observing wildlife, needed to become something more than just capturing beautiful images. The park rangers hadn't arrived. There was no official guidance. It was just Mike, a line of frightened tourists and a highway full of vulnerable, stressed bears, with a storm closing in fast. Standing there, snow gathering on his jacket, camera still hanging from his neck, Mike took a deep breath. He could feel it, something big was about to happen. And whether he liked it or not, he was about to play a role he never imagined. Before I take you to that critical turning point, where instincts collided with danger, and where one man's decision became the difference between tragedy and survival, let me ask you something from the heart. If stories like this stir something inside you, if you believe in the incredible bond between humans and animals, if you want to follow real, emotional, life and death rescue stories straight from the wild, this is the perfect time to become part of our community. Join us right now by hitting that subscribe button. Be part of these journeys. Be part of the moments that remind us how raw and beautiful nature can be. And trust me, what's coming next in this story, you won't want to miss. As the snow began to fall with more intensity, the atmosphere along the Grand Loop Road shifted from lighthearted excitement to something much heavier. The playful tone that had filled the air when the first few bears appeared was now gone. There was a subtle, almost invisible change happening, not just in the weather, but in the behavior of the animals. Mike kept his eyes fixed on the bears. Over years of photographing wildlife in extreme conditions, He had learned to spot small details that others often missed. And now, those details were screaming at him. The way the mother bears paced back and forth, their movements stiff and frantic, as if torn between staying to protect their cubs and fleeing to find safety. The restless flick of their ears, the low guttural sounds coming from their throats, not aggressive but anxious, protective, afraid. Then came something Mike would never forget, the sound of a cub crying. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a knife. High-pitched, repetitive, desperate, a sound that only those familiar with bear behavior would recognize as a distress call. Mike's stomach twisted. Cubs didn't make that sound unless something was very, very wrong. Several tourists, still oblivious to the deepening danger, were stepping out of their cars with their phones, laughing nervously. Some moved closer to get a better angle for their Instagram stories or TikTok feeds. They zoomed in on the trembling cubs, the anxious mothers. They filmed the older bears moving restlessly between the rows of parked cars. But none of them realized they were standing in the middle of an unfolding crisis. Mike wanted to shout at them, to tell them to get back inside their vehicles, to warn them that scared, stressed, hungry bears, especially mothers with cubs, could react unpredictably. But for a moment, even he was frozen, watching, processing, trying to piece together what exactly was happening. That's when he noticed something else, another layer of wrongness. The bears weren't acting territorial. They weren't displaying dominance or aggression. Instead, they looked displaced, disoriented, as if something had driven them out of their usual habitat and forced them onto this busy stretch of highway. Mike scanned the tree line beyond the road. Normally, bears would retreat at the first sight of so many people and vehicles. But today, they lingered. They hesitated. They stayed. And then, like a warning shot from nature itself, a sudden violent gust of wind slammed through the valley. Snow swirled around the vehicles like a thick white curtain, reducing visibility within seconds. What was moments ago a scenic view was now turning into a near whiteout. A group of tourists ran back to their cars, slipping on the now icy pavement. One woman screamed as a bear passed uncomfortably close to her. Another man dropped his phone, too focused on running to bother picking it up. The playful filming had stopped. Panic was creeping in. Mike's heart pounded. He grabbed his radio scanner, hoping to catch any updates from park rangers. Static. Then, a broken transmission. A storm front. Faster than expected. Road closures imminent. Backcountry evacuation recommended. Mike's pulse quickened. A backcountry evacuation? That never happened unless there was extreme, immediate danger. That explained why the bears were here. They'd likely been forced down from higher ground by the oncoming blizzard, their dens now buried or inaccessible, their paths cut off by snowdrifts and wind-blown trees. With instinct guiding them, they'd followed the only open path left, the road. Another cub began to cry, this time louder, longer. Its tiny body shook uncontrollably as it stood near a snow-covered guardrail, separated from its mother by a few yards of cars and terrified humans. The mother bear lunged forward, swiping at the air, but hesitated at the wall of metal and people between her and her cub. Mike's breath caught in his throat. This was escalating faster than anyone could control. He knew that if the mother couldn't reach her cub soon, she would panic. And a panicked bear, especially a protective mother, could turn a bad situation into something catastrophic within seconds. Looking around, Mike noticed drivers frantically turning their keys, trying to move their vehicles to create space. But with cars parked so closely and the road slick with fresh ice, no one was going anywhere fast. The snowfall intensified. Flakes the size of coins whipped sideways in the air, driven by unforgiving winds. Visibility dropped to mere feet. Tourists began honking horns, hoping the noise would scare the bears back into the woods. But it only seemed to agitate them more. Mike scanned the road for any sign of park personnel. Nothing. Not a single ranger vehicle. Not even flashing lights in the distance. The storm had caught everyone off guard, leaving this stretch of Yellowstone without official help. At least for now. Inside his jacket pocket, Mike's fingers closed around his emergency flare, a last resort. He had carried it for years on wilderness shoots but had never actually used it. Lighting it here could push the bears back, but it could also trigger panic, both in the animals and in the trapped tourists. His mind raced through scenarios. Every choice carried risk. Every second mattered. Somewhere in the swirling snow, another cub cried out. And for Mike, that was the final push. He knew in that moment, doing nothing wasn't an option. With shaking hands and a heart pounding loud enough that he could feel it in his throat, Mike stepped out from the relative safety of his truck. Into the cold, into the unknown, into the very center of a crisis that no one on that road would ever forget. The cold hit like a punch to the chest. The moment Mike stepped out of his truck, the full force of the storm wrapped around him. Icy wind whipped across the highway, lifting sheets of snow from the ground and flinging them sideways. Visibility dropped even further. What had been a few feet now felt like mere inches. The distant outlines of vehicles disappeared into a swirling white blur. It was as if the entire world had shrunk down to this one frozen stretch of road, and everyone trapped on it. Mike squinted against the blizzard, pulling his scarf tighter around his face. The snow stung his skin like tiny shards of glass. His camera swung heavily against his chest, useless now. This wasn't a time for pictures. This was survival. The bears, already restless, became increasingly agitated. Their movements turned sharper, more unpredictable. One mother Ursa began pacing aggressively near the front of a parked SUV, her massive paws crunching over the snow and ice with terrifying power. Her breath came in heavy, visible clouds. The cubs huddled close to her legs, their small bodies shaking, both from cold and fear. Another adult bear stood on its hind legs, scanning the horizon, ears pinned back against its head. It let out a low, guttural roar that sent a wave of panic through the nearest tourists. A family inside a minivan screamed. A man in a pickup truck locked his doors and frantically fumbled with his phone, trying to call for help. But there was no signal. The road was officially a trap. Snowdrifts began to build along the edges of the asphalt. The tires of some vehicles were already half buried. Those who hadn't moved their cars earlier now had no chance. Engines sputtered as drivers tried to reverse or pull forward, but the tires only spun helplessly against the icy surface. Mike's boots crunched as he moved closer to the center of the chaos. He waved his arms, shouting to the drivers still outside their vehicles. "Get back inside, stay calm, don't make sudden moves." His voice struggled against the howl of the wind, but a few people heard him. Some ran back to their cars, others, still frozen in place, unsure what to do next. The bears' stress levels climbed with every passing second. Mike watched one younger bear, a subadult male, start circling between the vehicles, sniffing the air, snapping its jaws, clearly unable to decide whether to run or defend its space. This wasn't normal territorial behavior. This was fear-driven confusion. The snow intensified. Large, wet flakes now fell faster, sticking to the fur of the bears and the windshields of the cars. Mike's own jacket was already stiff and wet. Every breath felt colder, heavier. Then came the sound that Mike had dreaded most, the distant crack of a tree splitting somewhere in the forest beyond the road. A warning sign that the weight of snow and the force of the wind were beginning to take their toll on the landscape itself. Mike's mind raced. Every wildlife safety briefing he'd ever attended, every survival scenario he'd rehearsed mentally, all played back at lightning speed. But this situation was beyond any training. This wasn't just a bear encounter. This was a full-blown emergency, a perfect storm, literally and figuratively. The mothers grew more frantic. One tried to cross the road to reach her separated cub, but a sudden burst of honking from a nearby car startled her. She reared up on her hind legs, swiping at the air, sending snow flying. The cub squealed. The tourists inside the cars panicked, some ducking, others screaming. Mike's heart pounded. The danger was reaching a boiling point. The bears were on edge, the people were terrified, and the weather showed no signs of mercy. Taking a deep breath, Mike pulled out his emergency flare. Not yet, he thought. Not unless absolutely necessary. But just knowing he had it gave him a small sense of control in a situation spiraling rapidly out of it. Another violent gust of wind roared down the valley, shaking the trees along the roadside. Loose branches snapped and tumbled onto the pavement. Snow piled higher around the cars. People began to realize they weren't going anywhere soon. The gravity of it all settled over Mike like a second layer of ice. He looked around, at the trapped families, the crying children, the restless bears, the suffocating storm, and felt the weight of responsibility press hard against his chest. And that's when a new thought crossed his mind, a terrifying realization. If the bears couldn't find a safe exit soon, and if the humans continued making noise and moving unpredictably, someone could get seriously hurt, or worse. The air filled with another desperate cub cry, louder this time, longer. The mother let out a rumbling growl, moving again toward the cluster of vehicles where her cub was stranded. Mike's pulse hammered in his ears. The decision point was coming fast. He couldn't wait much longer. But before I take you to the moment where Mike made that split-second choice, let me ask you something. If you were standing right there, in the freezing snow, trapped between wild animals in distress and terrified tourists, what would you do? Would you stay inside your car? Would you step out to help? Or would fear freeze you in place like it did to so many others that day? Tell me in the comments below. I'd really love to know what you think. What would you do in a situation like this? Mike stood frozen for a brief second, his breath coming out in heavy clouds as the cold bit into his skin. The screams from the tourists echoed in the air, mixing with the growls and cries of the bears and the howling of the wind. He could hear voices shouting from inside the cars, pleading, panicked voices. "Get back in your truck," one man yelled from a nearby SUV, his face pressed against the foggy window. "Are you crazy? Stay inside," another voice called out. Mike's heart pounded. Every piece of training he'd ever received screamed for him to listen to them. Every wildlife safety protocol drilled into his head over the years was clear. Stay inside your vehicle. Do not engage. Do not interfere. Let nature take its course. That was the rule. Always. But staring at the terrified cub stranded near the guardrail, watching its mother pace frantically, slamming her paws against the icy ground torn between flight and fight, something inside Mike refused to sit still. This wasn't just another photography assignment. This wasn't a safe observation from a distance. This was real. This was immediate. This was life and death, playing out in front of him. A flood of memories rushed through his mind, flashbacks from past fieldwork in Alaska, where he'd once witnessed a similar scene, a mother bear caught between danger and her cubs. He remembered how that ended, how inaction had cost lives, both animal and human. He remembered the helplessness he felt back then, and how he'd promised himself if he ever faced something like that again, he wouldn't stand by. But still, stepping out from safety meant risking everything. His life, the lives of the tourists, even the bears. Mike's eyes darted across the scene. The snow was now a thick wall, visibility no more than a few feet. The line of vehicles stretched like an immovable metal snake along the highway, with no room for escape. The bears were trapped just as much as the people were. He thought about the cub, its tiny body shivering uncontrollably, its desperate cries growing weaker, the mother's breathing, the way she shifted her weight, lowering her body, muscles tightening like a coiled spring. One wrong move, and she could charge. It wouldn't be aggression, it would be fear, pure, survival-driven fear. Mike swallowed hard. His hands trembled, not just from the cold but from the gravity of the choice in front of him. He felt the flare still in his pocket, a last resort he wasn't ready to use. The bright red tube felt heavy, like a reminder of how bad this could get if he made the wrong move. "Think, Mike. Think," he muttered under his breath. For a split second, he closed his eyes and drew in a shaky breath. And that's when he stopped listening to the noise around him. He stopped hearing the tourists, stopped worrying about the rules, stopped calculating statistics about bear attacks and human injuries. Instead, he listened to something else, something older, something primal. The instinct that had driven him into the wild time and time again. The instinct that whispered, These animals weren't the enemy. They were victims of the same storm, victims of circumstance, creatures as desperate and afraid as the people trapped in their cars. Mike opened his eyes, jaw set with a determination he hadn't felt in years. Ignoring the shouted warnings behind him, he stepped forward, one slow, calculated step at a time. Hands raised, palms out, showing he was no threat. His boots crunched against the ice with each movement. His heart slammed against his ribs, but he kept going. The closest mother bear swung her massive head toward him, nostrils flaring, eyes wide with confusion and suspicion. Mike froze mid-step, keeping his posture low and non-threatening, murmuring softly, words he wasn't even sure she could hear over the wind, but hoping the tone, the rhythm of his voice, might calm her. The cub's cries grew more urgent. The mother responded with a low, rolling grunt, half warning, half plea. Mike's instinct screamed that she was moments away from making a decision herself, fight or flight. Mike adjusted his stance, slowly taking off his gloves despite the cold, hoping to appear more human, less threat. He moved sideways, never making direct eye contact, keeping the bears in his peripheral vision while scanning for a path, an opening wide enough for the mother to reach her cub safely without charging through the cars, or worse, through the people. His mind flashed again to past moments in the wild, to standing on the edge of a riverbank, photographing a grizzly fishing for salmon, to the time he watched a black bear teach her cubs to climb trees. These weren't just memories now. They were lessons. Lessons he would use to read every flick of muscle, every shift in weight, every sound from these bears. Another gust of wind slammed through the valley, and the cub slipped on the icy ground, falling onto its side. The sound it made, raw, scared, helpless, hit Mike like a punch to the chest. Without hesitation, Mike took another step forward. He waved his arms at the surrounding drivers, motioning for them to stay put. No more honking. No more shouting. The entire atmosphere needed to shift if there was any chance to de-escalate the tension. Inside the nearest vehicles, people stared at him, wide-eyed, mouths open. Some were still filming. Others simply sat frozen, watching a man willingly walk toward danger, defying every piece of logic they understood. Mike didn't care. Not now. Because deep down, he knew this was the moment that would decide everything. The next few seconds would shape the outcome for every life on that road, human and animal alike. And as the snow continued to fall harder, cloaking the scene in even more uncertainty, Mike kept moving forward, toward the bears, toward the unknown, toward whatever fate was waiting for him on that frozen highway. Mike's breath felt like fire against the freezing air as he took another careful step forward. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to turn back, to retreat to the safety of his truck like everyone else. But he kept going. His heartbeat pounded in his ears louder than the howling wind. The mother bear's eyes stayed locked on him, her enormous body tense, her front paw halfway lifted, as if deciding whether to advance or retreat. Mike slowly raised his hands higher, speaking softly under his breath, his voice steady, deliberate. It wasn't the words that mattered. It was the tone, the rhythm, the signal that he meant no harm, that he wasn't a threat. Still, he knew things could spiral at any second. With slow, calculated movements, Mike began guiding the nearest drivers, signaling with sweeping hand gestures for them to reverse. Just a little. Create space. Give the bears a way out. Some understood instantly. Others hesitated, faces pale with fear. Engines sputtered to life. Tires struggled for traction on the ice, but gradually, the vehicles shifted backward, just enough to open a narrow corridor between the cars. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. Mike moved toward the first vehicle in line and with the flat of his hand slapped the metal side of the car hard. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed against the rock walls that framed the road, a deep, hollow bang that cut through the wind. The bears startled at the noise. Heads snapped up. The cubs flinched. The adult bears instinctively shuffled backward, retreating a few steps toward the tree line at the edge of the road. Mike moved to the next vehicle. Another set of hard bangs on the door panels. Another loud burst of sound. More movement from the bears. Slowly, painfully slowly, the animals began to shift. turning away from the line of vehicles. Their heavy paws crunched across the snow, their fur dusted white by the relentless storm. The mothers kept their cubs close, using their massive bodies to shield the little ones from the icy wind as they retreated. For a fleeting moment, Mike felt hope flicker in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was working. He moved down the line, repeating the process, car after car, creating a pattern of noise that urged the bears away from the highway and toward the cover of the trees. Drivers watched in disbelief, some with hands clasped over their mouths, others still filming as Mike became the unlikeliest leader in a highway evacuation of wild bears. But then, just as the largest group began moving off the road, Mike heard it. A tiny, sharp cry. His stomach dropped. Scanning the road, he spotted the source. One of the smaller cubs had gotten separated. In the chaos and confusion, it had veered off the corridor and now stood alone, shivering violently near a snowbank on the opposite side of the highway. The mother bear hadn't noticed yet. She was too focused on keeping her other cub close and moving toward safety. Mike's heart slammed against his ribs. He knew what would happen next if he didn't act fast. If the mother realized her baby was missing and couldn't reach it quickly enough, she might turn back. Or worse, she might panic and charge straight through the line of vehicles to reach her cub. Without thinking, Mike pivoted and bolted toward the stranded cub. His boot slipped across the icy asphalt, nearly sending him to the ground, but he regained his balance just in time. Stay calm. Stay focused, he muttered to himself, approaching the cub as carefully as the storm would allow. The tiny bear trembled, crying out again, struggling to climb the snowbank it had slid down moments earlier. Mike knew he couldn't touch it. Not only would that trigger a dangerous scent transfer, but the mother's reaction could be immediate and violent. Instead, he crouched a few feet away, stomping his boots loudly, waving his arms, shouting deep, rhythmic noises into the air to get the mother's attention. It worked. Across the road, the mother bear paused. Her ears perked, her head whipped toward the sound. She spotted her cub. Without hesitation, she charged, but not at Mike. She barreled through the snow straight toward her baby. Mike froze, forcing himself to stay absolutely still. The massive bear closed the distance in seconds, scooping her cub up with a gentle nudge of her nose, her body shielding it once again. She let out a low, relieved rumble, her instincts guiding her next move. Without looking back, she turned and followed the others toward the forest, her two cubs stumbling along behind her. Mike let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His legs threatened to give out beneath him, but he stayed upright, watching until the last bear disappeared behind the curtain of trees and snow. The highway, now eerily empty, was silent for the first time all day. Tourists began climbing out of their vehicles, still stunned, some clapping, others crying, many just standing in shocked disbelief at what they had witnessed. Mike turned back toward the long line of cars, snow caking his jacket, his hands numb, but a shaky smile creeping onto his face. And if you felt even a fraction of the adrenaline, fear, and hope that filled this moment, if this story of courage and instinct stirred something in you, please take a second and show your support. Give this video a like right now. It helps more people discover these incredible stories of survival and connection between humans and wildlife. Every click helps us share more moments like this. Moments that show the heart, the fear, and the beauty of nature at its rawest. But this wasn't the end, because just as Mike thought the worst was over, something else happened. Something no one, not even him, could have predicted. The silence that followed was almost surreal. After hours of relentless tension, fear, and adrenaline, the sudden absence of noise felt as heavy as the storm itself. Where moments earlier the air had been filled with the frantic cries of cubs, the low growls of anxious mother bears, and the shouts of panicked tourists, now only the soft hiss of falling snow remained. Mike stood in the middle of the icy road, his breath ragged, his body trembling, not just from the cold, but from the sheer emotional weight of what had just happened. The cold bit into his face, but he barely noticed. His eyes stayed fixed on the tree line, watching the last shadows of the bears vanish into the dense snow-covered forest. The cub he had risked everything to help was now safely tucked between its mother's legs, following her into the trees. The reunion had been brief but powerful. The way the mother bear had nudged her baby, licking the snow from its fur with a tenderness that contrasted so sharply with her massive size and strength. It was a moment that pulled tears from more than one onlooker. People began stepping cautiously out of their vehicles, their faces pale, expressions a mix of disbelief and overwhelming relief. Some still held their phones in shaking hands, videos forgotten. Others simply stood there, staring at Mike as though trying to process what they had just witnessed. A woman near the front of the car line collapsed into tears, sobbing into her gloved hands. A man behind her clapped, once, then twice, and within seconds, more people joined in. The applause grew louder, a ripple of human emotion breaking through the frozen air. Mike lowered his head, exhausted and overwhelmed. He hadn't done it for recognition. He hadn't thought of cameras or cheers or applause. He had done it because in that moment, it had felt like the only option, the only choice that could possibly lead to safety for everyone involved, humans and animals alike. Suddenly, the distant wail of sirens broke the air. Red and blue lights flickered through the snow as two park ranger vehicles appeared at the far end of the highway, tires crunching over fresh snowdrifts, moving as quickly as the dangerous conditions would allow. Mike felt a wave of relief wash over him. Help had finally arrived. The rangers stepped out, bundled in heavy winter gear, radios crackling with static as they surveyed the scene. One of them, a tall man with a gray beard and the name tag Garrett, approached Mike directly. "Are you the one responsible for all this?" the ranger asked, gesturing toward the now empty stretch of road. Mike nodded slowly, still catching his breath. "I just did what I could." Garrett shook his head in disbelief, letting out a low whistle. "You did more than that. You probably saved a lot of lives today and on both sides." The rangers quickly began organizing the tourists, checking for injuries, making sure vehicles were operational enough to move once the snow cleared. A few drivers needed medical attention. Nothing major, just minor hypothermia symptoms and anxiety attacks. But overall, everyone was alive. Everyone was safe. Mike watched as people began exchanging stories with each other, showing their shaky cell phone footage, pointing toward the spot where the bears had stood, where the cub had cried, where he himself had stood between them all. And through it all, his mind kept going back to the sight of that mother bear and her cub disappearing into the woods. Nature and humanity had shared something rare that day, something fragile and unscripted. A moment of understanding that even without words had spoken louder than anything Mike could have imagined. Snow continued to fall, softer now, blanketing the scene like nature's way of erasing the chaos, covering the tire tracks, softening the sharp edges left by fear and survival instincts. But even as the storm calmed, Mike knew this story wasn't finished yet. Because sometimes, nature has one last surprise, waiting just around the corner. Mike stood in the middle of the now empty road, staring at the thick layer of snow that covered everything like a fresh, untouched canvas. The tire tracks, the paw prints, even the places where he had stood just minutes earlier. All of it was already fading beneath the steady fall of white. The forest ahead looked calm again, almost as if none of it had ever happened. The same trees that had seemed menacing just hours ago now stood in quiet stillness, their branches weighed down by snow. The howling wind had softened, reduced to nothing more than a cold breeze whispering through the pines. Mike let out a long breath, the vapor hanging in the air before dissolving. His hands rested on his hips, gloves damp from snow and sweat. And for the first time since the nightmare had begun, he allowed himself to pause and think. He replayed every second in his mind, the frantic cries of the cubs, the mother bears pacing in terror, the tourists screaming, the icy cold against his face and the terrifying uncertainty of each step he took toward the bears. And yet, in the middle of all that chaos, something else had happened. Something powerful. Something unexpected. It was as if, for a brief, impossible moment, humans and animals, two species usually separated by fear and instinct, had understood each other. Mike's mind kept returning to that image. The mother bear finding her cub, nudging it close, leading it back to safety. The way the other bears had responded to the space he'd cleared, as if they too understood it was their chance to escape unharmed. And even the people, complete strangers from different places, languages, and backgrounds, all frozen together in the same fight for survival. What drove him that day wasn't just knowledge of wildlife behavior. It wasn't just adrenaline. It was instinct, human instinct. The same primal force that had guided the bears out of the mountains. The same survival instinct that had driven the cubs to cry for help. It was all part of something bigger. Mike felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent years in the wild, photographing animals from behind the safety of lenses and distance. But today, that distance had disappeared. Today, he had been part of the story. His gaze drifted down the highway, where tourists were now packing up, sharing their videos, still processing what they had just lived through. Mike wondered how many of them would go home and tell their families about this day. How many would see bears differently now, not just as dangerous predators but as living beings with families, fears, and instincts of their own. This experience had left something inside him forever changed. And standing there, lost in thought, a small smile touched the corner of his lips. Because maybe, this is what these moments are for, to remind us that nature doesn't separate us as much as we like to believe, that sometimes, in the most extreme situations, we're not so different after all. Before I take you to the next part of this incredible story, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from? Tell us in the comments below. We're always amazed at how far these messages of compassion and courage can reach. In the days that followed, Yellowstone slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The snow that had once blanketed the highway melted under the spring sun, revealing the familiar curves and cracks of the Grand Loop Road. Park rangers worked tirelessly to clear fallen branches and debris, restoring safe passage for the steady stream of tourists eager to witness the wonders of America's most famous national park. But for those who had been there, for those who had lived through that day of fear, courage, and unexpected unity, something had changed. Mike returned to the same stretch of road a few days later, this time with his camera back in his hands, but with a different purpose. The storm had passed. The air was crisp and patches of green began peeking through where the snow had retreated. Elk grazed near the tree line. Birds sang from branches still heavy with moisture, and there, deep within the forest's edge, he saw them. The bears. Not close, not threatening, but visible enough for his lens to catch their silhouettes moving gracefully among the trees. The mother bear who had fought so desperately to reach her cub was there, leading her little ones through the underbrush, teaching them, guiding them, helping them adapt to a world that could be both beautiful and brutal. Mike adjusted the focus on his camera and zoomed in just enough to capture their movements without disturbing them. As he clicked the shutter, the sound felt different this time. This wasn't just another wildlife photo. It was a memory, frozen in time. A reminder of what it had taken to get them here. Safe. Alive. Down the road, tourists began returning. Park shuttles resumed their routes. Families walked along the designated viewing areas, binoculars in hand, eyes scanning the horizon with renewed curiosity. Conversations buzzed with questions about the bears, stories from that unforgettable day already evolving into local legend. Some visitors asked rangers about the man who walked toward the bears. Others pointed out the exact spot where the cub had been stranded. People shared phone videos with friends and strangers alike. What had started as fear had transformed into respect, into understanding. Mike watched from a distance, listening as kids asked their parents why the bears had been on the road, why the man had helped them, and if the bears were okay now. And for the first time in days, Mike smiled, really smiled, because he knew the answers. He had lived them. The connection between humans and animals wasn't something you could always explain with logic. It wasn't about statistics or safety manuals. It was about instinct, compassion, the gut feeling that tells you when it's time to act, even when everything about the situation tells you to stay still. Looking at the quiet forest, Mike felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. Maybe the biggest lesson from that day wasn't about danger at all. Maybe it was about what happens when the human heart listens to the call of nature. And as Mike packed up his gear and took one last look at the tree line, He knew one thing for sure. Some moments in life change you forever. Before Mike climbed back into his truck and turned the key in the ignition, he paused one last time, allowing himself a few more seconds to absorb everything that had happened over the past few days. The highway that had once been a scene of panic and uncertainty was now just a road again. The snowbanks had melted down, the ice patches gone, and tire marks showed the steady flow of life moving on. But in Mike's heart, and in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed that day, the memory remained. Sharp, vivid, unforgettable. He knew that while this chapter had closed, there would always be more stories waiting just around the corner. More moments where humans and animals would cross paths, sometimes in fear, sometimes in hope, but always leaving behind lessons no one could predict. Mike reached for his camera, now resting on the passenger seat, and smiled. The photos from that day wouldn't just be images frozen in time. They would be a reminder of what it means to care, to act, and to be present when nature calls for help in ways we least expect. And now, it's your turn. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the adrenaline, the fear, the hope, and that surge of connection between human instinct and wild survival, this is the perfect time to become part of our community. Click that subscribe button right now and join us for more real, emotional, and inspiring animal rescue stories from around the world. We share moments that capture the raw power of nature, the beauty of wildlife, and the incredible decisions humans make when faced with life or death situations. And don't stop here. On your screen right now, you'll see our next recommended video. Another breathtaking story that I promise will move you just as deeply as this one did. Go ahead, click and continue this journey with us. Because when it comes to the bond between humans and animals, there's always another story waiting to be told.